Need to move over.
Anita, you're on.
22 pounds of peaches.
Pardon?
She said 22 pounds of peaches.
Yeah.
Oh,
Delicious.
Oh, there they are.
That's a lot of peaches.
yeah.
I freeze them and then we use them in the morning with our yogurt or make smoothies.
Unfortunately, it probably only took like 10 minutes to pick them.
Wow.
Wow.
Mm.
What chapter are we working on? I'm finally back.
Second half, chapter 20, all the way up through 23.
Okay.
We probably won't get that far today, though.
Okay. But you're starting at what, 22?
22, yeah, 20 verse 22.
20 to 22?
Wait a minute.
20
Verse 22.
verse 22.
Oh, verse 22, not chapter. I'm looking at chapters here.
Huh?
So
Okay.
we finished the 10 Commandments, and
Okay.
now we're going to do what's called the Book of the Covenant, which is the next section. And I didn't have time today to do that because I wasn't in the office. I work from home on Wednesdays because it's easier to do the Bible study from here. But I have another outline that I'll give you on this next section, the second half of chapter 20, all the way up through 23. It's another outline for you, and we'll go over that outline in a little bit. But just some preliminary kinds of things. What this does, this is basically it's a parallel to Deuteronomy chapter 7. So you can just write that in the margin if you want. You know, 2 vertical lines means parallel, and then Deuteronomy chapter 7. It's basically the same thing. What this is a later addition to the original text that explains the reasons behind, or not really reasons behind, but explains the thinking of the 10 Commandments. Goes into a little more detail about some of the things like how to treat slaves and what to do if your ox gores somebody else, who's liable, and all that kind of stuff. You know, it almost sounds like the rule of law for today, actually. Except the ultimate judge in this case was God himself.
Well, it's
And if you
talking
lost,
Deuteronomy 7.
if you lost a lot of times, the sentence was death. So, there was no messing around. Okay, just another quick note. Rita will not be joining us today, I don't think, because just as she got ready to leave to come home for the Bible study, the cleaners finally showed up.
Mm.
They're supposed to be there at between 8 and 9 in the morning, and they just showed up at 1:35.
Oh,
Right.
And there was only one of them instead of 2. So she didn't want to, tell them that we were going to leave at 2 o'clock or whatever, so they would hurry up and do a lousy job. So she's going to stay there.
Right.
She might try to join us, but I doubt it. So that's what's going on there.
yeah. Ann kind of overdid yesterday, so she's just chilling today, and she won't be with us either. So,
Okay.
she has her good days and bad days, and
Well, sure.
Jim and Kathy came over last night. They brought pizza with them, and we played cards and stayed up late.
That'll do it.
That's
Yep.
the old kid, huh?
Okay.
Having fun is hard work.
It doesn't look like anybody else is going to join us. At least there's nobody waiting to be admitted. So a real quick footnote, and this is basically to Dennis and maybe Royal too. Larry sent me an email saying that the past lessons for the Bible study are no longer being recorded or uploaded to the web page.
I'm looking at that. I mean, they are there. I'm just really trying to figure out why the link isn't getting them there, getting people to it.
So it's just a link problem.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Well,
because they're all up there.
Okay, great. We'll figure that out. And we'll
Yep.
get it back.
Yeah, I replied to him. I just saw the email, so I replied to him today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so if everybody will mute, we'll go ahead and open with prayer and begin our Bible study, because this is a lot of stuff to get through today. And like I said, we probably won't get through it all. Heavenly Father, we ask that you guide our study today and open our hearts and minds to the leading of your Spirit as we once again delve into your word. We ask that you would open our hearts and minds to what you would have us learn about the practice of the Israelites as they make their journey through the wilderness and on to the promised land. Help us to remember the lessons that you were trying to teach them, that you are in charge, that you are the God above all gods, and we should have no other gods before you, that we are to treat one another fairly, love one another as you first loved us. Be with us, help us, and guide us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, chapter 20, verse 22, and it starts right off. The Hebrew phrase there, you should know this by now, Koamar Yahweh, thus says the Lord. This is what you shall say to the people of Israel, the people I've chosen to save. You yourselves have now seen how I speak to you from heaven. Then in the next verse, 23, it's a repeat of the first commandment. You shall not make gods of silver alongside of me, nor shall you make for yourselves gods of gold. Now, why did they separate out silver and gold? Because, as I said, this is a redaction. That's the fancy scholarly word for people came along later and added more to the text, okay? Probably in the 6th or 5th century BC. Okay, the reason that is separated between silver and gold, and not just graven images or idols, which is what the original text says, is because the sin of while Moses was up on the mountain talking to God, what did the people do? They melted down all their gold, remember, and they made a golden calf. So this gets put in there as don't make an image of gold that you worship. So that's what's behind that. Then in the next verse, verse 24, another very interesting verse because of the backstory to it. An altar of earth you shall make for me, and sacrifice upon it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your cattle. In every place where I reveal my name, I will come to you and bless you. But if you make for me an altar of stone, you must not build it of cut stone. For if you use your tools, some of you may have chisels in there, that's a later English edition. If you use your tools upon it, you profane it. Okay, now we're going to stop there. What is an altar of earth? Sounds like just a pile of dirt. We don't know for sure what that would be. It wouldn't last very long, wouldn't be very significant, just a mound of dirt. That's not really what the Hebrew says. Basically, a very loose translation of the Hebrew, and there's no English word that comes close to this. Basically, what it's saying is make it out of natural materials that you find. In other words, don't manufacture, don't shape it with tools and everything and dress it all up fancy. Now, what was the reason for that? Is because that's what the Canaanites did. And they carved all these fancy altars out of stone. And you know what they did with those fancy altars? They sacrificed children. It wasn't just a blood sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice of children. And of course, God forbid that. So he says, don't do it like the Canaanites do. That's what this is all about. And if let me get out of the way and I will show you one of these altars. This is at Arad, A-R-A-D, in Israel. This is what one of those altars look like. You can see the scale of the man standing there, and then off over his left shoulder, you can see the ramp that leads up to it. And then up on the top up there is where they had their sacrifice. But see, those are all stones that are just piled together like an English stone field wall. You know, they just fit it together. They didn't cut it with stones or hammers or anything else. They just piled it up. And then you see the ramp going up there. Now that's important for the next verse. And I'll explain that to you too. Hi, Karen. Welcome. The next verse, in verse 26, you must not ascend my altar by steps, so that your nakedness will not be exposed on it. Now there's two pieces to this. First, you need to understand that in the Old Testament, especially in these early times, uncovered feet were just as obscene as anything else that was uncovered. It was obscene. And most people didn't have shoes. They were barefoot. So to step on God's altar barefoot is like mooning God. Okay, so you don't do that. The second thing is, and this is a little crass, especially because I see a young person down there with Karen on my screen, is remember what these people wore and what they didn't wear. So if you're walking up on God's altar, what becomes visible that shouldn't, right? So once the altar's built, everything's up there. You don't go walking up on the altar because that's an offense to God. It had nothing to do with the fact that the body was bad or impure or any of that kind of stuff. It was just an affront to the Lord. This was a sacred time. They only built the altars where God told them to. And he only told them to build altars at certain points in their journey to commemorate things, a battle, a victory, to remind them of something that God had done, a blessing that he had given them. All those things were important. So they would build an altar and they would sacrifice. There were also times of the year that they had these altars and they would celebrate too. And we'll get to that a little later in our chapter. But those are some of the things that you need to be aware of here, is that they were very, the book of the covenant was very specific about those kinds of rules and regulations. Okay, that's the end of chapter 20. Now we get into chapter 21. And it says, these are the laws that you will set before my people, or them, you might have in your translation. And notice here, this is something that's peculiar because this phrase only occurred when the Egyptians were talking about the Hebrews back in Egypt. They called them Hebrew slaves. So here you have in verse 21, verse 1, these are the laws that you shall set before my people for them when you buy a Hebrew slave. And this was thought of as a derogatory term about Hebrews. So you know that this was added generations later because now they've come to accept that. A slave who is a member of the covenant organization, the covenant family. In other words, a Jewish person who's a slave. And yes, they had Jewish people as slaves. Okay. That person shall serve for 6 years. And in the 7th year, he shall go free without payment. Again, this is the practice of Shabbat or Sabbath, the sabbatical year, the 7th year, the Sabbath year. So they could only be a slave for 6 years. In the 7th year, they go free. We're not sure because, again, of the context of this construct in Hebrew, whether that means that they get a year off, that 7th year off, and then they have to go back to being a slave, or whether they were permanently free. That's not explicit in the text. We don't know for sure. But we do know that when it talks about land when they're in their farming practices, they could grow crops on a land for 6 years. In the 7th year, they had to let it lay fallow. And on that 7th year, whatever came up on its own, that was volunteer, as the farmers all know about. The volunteer stuff would come up, and then that was left for the poor people, and it was left for the animals. They could glean that, and they could have that free of charge. Nobody, it was a way to help take care of the animals and the people who didn't have much. So some people point to that and say, well, they only had 1 year off, and then they had to come back to work after that 7th year. Others say they were permanently free, and we just don't know for sure. There's, it just wasn't made clear enough. They understood it, but obviously we, in this day and age, don't. It never survived in the text. Okay, more stuff about slaves here. If a slave comes in single, if he begins his servitude single, he shall go out single. If he begins his service married, then his wife will go out with him. You see, this is where they get that whole business of being free forever, because it sounds like they can leave now. Verse 4, if his master gives him a wife and she bears the slave sons or daughters, the woman and her children belong to her master, not to her husband, but to her master.
Mhm.
And the servant shall go out single. If the servant or slave should state plainly, I love my master, I love my wife, and I love my children, and I do not wish to be freed, then his master shall bring him before God, and he shall bring him to the door or to the door post, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall remain his slave for life. That's another argument for the whole 7-year thing. On the 7th year, they were all set free. But if they were going to be a permanent slave, then they were marked by having their ear pierced. And they did this. And again, this is I hate to keep saying it's a lousy translation, because these people who translate this are much more intelligent than I will ever be. But when they talk about bring him to the door or the doorpost, what they're referring to is the entrance to the tabernacle, because they didn't live in cities. They were nomads. They wandered. But they did have this tent that they set up for worship. And all through Israel's history, as we studied about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, when they went to find wives, remember, they were always met at the city gate. And everything that happened at the city gate. It was a public gathering place where there were lots of people and things could be witnessed. So as they're nomads wandering around where there are no cities, the only city gate, the only public place they had for people to witness things like that was the door of the tabernacle. So that's where this piercing of the ear of the slave took place, in front of all the people, so that they could see that, yes, he entered into it willingly and became legitimately a lifetime servant of his master. And that was the place that he did that. Okay, more about slaves. Verse 7. When a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. If she does not please her master, who has designated her for himself, then he must let her be ransomed. That means bought back by the people that she came from, her family or whatever. Now, let me explain something to you here. You know what a female slave is, right? She doesn't work in the fields. She's a concubine. She's a mistress to the master. Okay? All right. So if it says she does not please her master, who had designated her for himself, that's how we know what that is, then her family can buy her back. He does not have the right to sell her to a foreign people. And again, the word there is not really foreign, it's just to others. If he doesn't like her, he can sell her to, his best friend, or he can sell her to somebody that he knows, or somebody that was coming through in a caravan. It's not necessarily like a foreigner, but, somebody else. Because he broke faith with her, because he bought her, he was in a relationship with her. And they looked at that relationship almost as binding as they did a wedding or a marriage. So if she didn't please him or he didn't like her, then he could get rid of her. I know, it's not fair. If he designated her for his son, and a lot of times that happened, he shall show her the rights of a freeborn woman. So if he gives this concubine, this woman, to his son, she now becomes part of the family. She's a free person. He gives up his claim to her. And when she becomes part of the family, she gets all the rights and privileges of a free person in that family. They take care of her, they support her, they feed her, they nurture her children. They do all the things that you would normally do with a wife. And then verse 10, if he takes another wife, and they use the term concubine and wife interchangeably, they're the same word in Hebrew. I didn't say it was a fair language. It's just, that's the way they call it. If he takes another woman, he shall not withhold from the first woman her food, her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So in other words, he could have as many as he wanted. That's what this is actually saying. Verse 11, if he does not do these three things for her, she shall go free without anybody having to pay for her. In other words, he won't get paid and she gets to go free if he refuses to take care of her. So there was some form of social, not really welfare, but taking care of this woman who had agreed to be in this position with this master. So it's the Israelite book of the covenant here is very, very conscious of making sure that everybody is treated fairly. Even slaves had rights. And you'll see this later on. All right, verse 12. Whoever strikes a man and kills him shall be put to death. Literally, it says, shall be killed. However, if he didn't do it intentionally, and it happened by an act of God or accident, I will assign, this is God speaking, I will assign you a place to which he can flee. And this is, again, that whole business of sanctuary cities. Until the case is heard by the courts, doesn't say that he's innocent or guilty. It just says, you go there until the court decides, or till Moses or one of the elders decide, or God decides. And then at that time, the verdict comes down and you have to obey by the verdict. But in the meantime, to protect you from the relatives of the person who died, in other words, blood guilt, so they have a right, an eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, and we'll get to that in a little bit too. You're protected until such time as your case is heard from the court or in the court. Verse 14 says, but if a man schemes against another, and that's another kind of if he connives, if he plans on cheating, ripping them off, to kill them treacherously, if it's premeditated, that's a better word to use. You shall take him away even from my, and your translations might have the word altar, but the Hebrew here is specific about God's presence. And of course, God was present at his altar. So that's why a lot of your translations have that word, but you shall take him out of my sight is literally what it says. So he's cut off from God, cut off from the covenant, cut off from the people. And there you will put him to death. 9 times out of 10, they were stoned, which is a horrible way to die, I would imagine. Verse 15, whoever strikes, his father or mother shall be put to death. Again, the Hebrew word there is not hit or strike, but it literally means cause bodily harm to the point that they die. So if you don't want to take care of your parents anymore because they're not contributing to society or to the family or anything else, and you do something to cause them peril and they perish, then you're put to death. Again, you shall honor your father and mother. You shall not abuse them. And that's what this is all about. Again, it's a later redaction of that particular commandment. Then the next verse there, verse 16, whoever steals a man, kidnaps, in other words, shall be put to death, regardless of whatever he has sold him or he is still in his possession, which is a really awkward translation because it almost sounds like we're talking about a slave here, but we're not. We're talking about a free person because the word for slave, doulos, is totally different than the word here, which is basically, it's like the old Yiddish word, it's Menschen, which is actually a German word, which means people. So it's altogether different. So if you take somebody against their will and they're still in your possession, the penalty for that is death. You can't kidnap anybody. Then verse 17 is almost a direct translation or direct repeat of the fourth commandment. Whoever curses, again, abuses is a better way to understand that. Whoever mistreats his father or his mother shall be put to death. They couldn't underscore that enough. Parents were and ancestors were meant to be honored. They were meant to be respected. They were meant to be cherished. They were meant to be taken care of. There was a huge understanding in the Israeli faith, in the Jewish faith, the Jewish tradition, the cultic tradition, to make sure that everyone was treated fairly. And that's what really comes through this whole book of the covenant here. Okay, verse 18. When men quarrel, I love that translation. It, again, not real great. When two people, it's masculine, so it was referring to men because it most often happened with men. But when two men argue and fight, one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die, but he's wounded so bad that he can't function. He's laid up in bed, if you will. If he recovers so that he can walk around outside with his stick, the one who struck him will be cleared. So if you recover enough to walk around, even if you got to walk around with a stick or a cane or crutch or whatever, then that first person is not going to be put to death, except that the person who hit him and did this in the first place must pay him for his loss of time and shall see that he is thoroughly rehabilitated, made whole, literally in Hebrew. Verse 20. When a man strikes his male or female slave with a stick, and the slave dies on the spot, the slave must be avenged, which means whoever strikes a slave and he kills him, that person's going to be killed as well. And when they say, they use the word here, the concept of vengeance is you will die the same way that you killed that person. So if you kill somebody by hitting them with a stick, that's how you're going to die. Okay? We'll say more about that in a little bit. But if he survives, verse 21, if the slave survives a day or two, he cannot be avenged. There is no vengeance because he belongs to the master, the one who hit him. Now, you would think we're trying really hard to be fair here. That doesn't sound real fair to me, but it was a different time. Also, you need to know and recognize that this particular set of passages was used right here in the good old US of A in the 16, 17, and 1800s to support slavery and the things that a master could do to his slave. And let's face it, in a court of law, when you quoted scripture, that was as good as being the law itself. This is what God said in his book. So that's all we're doing. And they got away with that for any number of years, hundreds of years, actually. All right, verse 22. When men, and now there's not an argument, it's not a quarrel. Now they translated it as scuffle. You see how hard it is to translate some of these Hebrew words. And they injure a pregnant woman so that she loses her baby, but suffers no further harm other than the loss of the child. The one responsible shall pay whatever the woman's husband demands in accordance with an assessment. So the husband gets to decide how much the baby was worth that died, and the other person or persons have to pay them that fine or penalty. But now listen to the next verse in 23. But if there's no further harm, then you must give, and here's the famous phrase, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, lash for lash. And that's where we get our saying that's been around for, well, thousands of years. An eye for an eye. And you never really hear the whole verse, but it's pretty explicit and pretty extensive. Verse 26, when a man strikes the eye of his male or female slave and destroys that eye, he shall let him go free because of his eye, the damage to his eye. If he knocks out a tooth of his male or female slave, he shall let the slave go free because of the loss of his tooth. Now, do you see what's going on here? If you think back, the one that comes to mind for me, it was always, remember the documentary or the series Roots about slaves in the United States, the slavery in the United States. Remember how they always checked their teeth? When they were buying slaves, they would go up, they would open their mouth and check their teeth to make sure they had them all. Because if somebody knocked them out, they were worth much, much, much less. They had to be whole and complete. And again, that comes from scripture. They could argue this because of what it says in the Bible and get a cheaper price, which doesn't reflect very well on the way we practice, well, basic humanity in this country. So if you caused any damage to your servant, your slave, I'll just use that word, and they suffered a loss like that, then that person got to go free and you had to do without, because you had to take good care of them. You had to protect them and you had to honor them. Okay. Now we get into verse 28. This is about your ox. When an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, but its flesh cannot be eaten. The owner of the ox shall be free of liability. All he loses out is the ox. Now, let me explain. Do you know why the meat of the ox could not be eaten, even though the ox was killed for killing someone else? And the reason is when you stone an animal, a good modern example is roadkill. Nobody eats roadkill, in spite of what a lot of people say, okay? Nobody does. That's because the animals, when they're struck, they bruise horribly and blood gets into the meat. That meat cannot be drained of blood. And what's the Hebrew law about eating meat? It has to be kosher, without life. And blood is life. So if you can't properly drain the animal's blood, get all the blood out, because that's from God, that belongs to God, then you can't eat it. Simple as that. Remember all the way back in Genesis and Cain and Abel's story. When Cain killed Abel, his blood cried out to the Lord, and God saw and heard and wrought vengeance because of the taking of another's life, the taking of literally another's blood. So blood belongs to God. So you can't eat meat that's still got blood in it. That's not kosher, which means without blood. Now, a little side note here. I don't have anything here. Well, I do. I have some eyeglass cleaner here on my desk. And if you look at the label down at the bottom, and I know I won't be able to hold up the camera because you can't see it, there's a little U in a circle. You know what that means? That means that this eyeglass cleaner, which is not meant for human consumption, by the way, is kosher. Because the U in the circle means that the Rabbinical Hebrew Union, it's an organization of Jewish priests, have determined that this eyeglass cleaner is kosher. Even though we would never use it to consume, you still, it's okay for Jews to use it because it's without blood. You can find those symbols. It's either U in a circle or it's a K. You will find a K on the label. And both of those, one's the Rabbinical Hebrew Union, and the other one is something rabbi thing. And they're not competing, but they're two different groups that talk about things being kosher and give stamps of approval to that. You'll find it on aluminum foil. You'll find it on toothpaste. You'll find it on paper towels, anything and everything in modern society. Dishwashing detergent, which I guess in a way could kind of need to be kosher if it's washing the dishes that you eat with, that kind of stuff. But it's just, the whole kosher thing is crazy. But that's how seriously they take this of not eating something with blood in it, because the blood belonged to God. That's why when they sacrificed, they bled the animal first on the altar so that the blood went first to God. The life went to God, and then they burned the animal. And then later on, when Eli and his sons become priests, this is many generations down the road, probably a good 1,000 years on down the road, they decide that they're going to turn this sacrifice business into a barbecue industry. And they're eating very high on the cow here. They eat pigs, of course. I was going to say high on the hog, and I do that one right. but they would consume the meat because there was no blood in it. They figured there was no sin. And why just let it rot and go to waste and let animals eat it or flies or something else? They ate it. And God punished Eli and his whole family. His line was ended at that point because he did not correct his sons for taking what literally belonged to God. Okay. Where are we? Verse 36. If it is known that the ox had a record of previous gorings, in other words, if it was a bad ox, if it's gored other people too, and the owner refuses or fails to keep it under control, he must restore ox for ox, but he gets to keep the dead animal. So evidently they killed that ox in a different way, and he got to keep the meat. When a man steals an ox, verse 37, or a sheep, slaughters it, drains it of blood, and sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Pretty steep penalty here. Thieving was thought to be horrible. You didn't do that at all. And that's the end of chapter 21. Then it carries on into 22 with the very next verse. And here's another thing. I think I've said this before, but I'll say it again. It just bears hearing. There were no verse or chapter separations in the original Hebrew. Those were actually put into place in medieval Europe times, so they could tell what verse they were talking about. But if you look at the Hebrew Bible, there isn't, in the modern Hebrew Bible, yes, because we do the same thing. We refer to a chapter, we refer to a verse. But in the original texts, like the Hebrew Sinaiticus and other ancient texts, there are no verses, there are no chapter headings at all. It just carries right on. I mean, there's places where they stop and take a breath, but basically there's no punctuation in Hebrew. That's only in modern languages. That's not in ancient language at all. Okay, chapter 22, verse 1. If a thief is caught in the act of breaking into a house and is fatally injured, if he's killed in this process, nobody is at fault. There's no blood guilt. So if you're caught in the act, but there's a qualification here. Verse 2, after sunrise, which means when you can see what's going on, you are responsible. There is blood guilt in that case. And so the person who kills a thief has to make full restitution. What does that sound like? Our modern day law of victims' rights. And by victim, I mean the thief, not the person being robbed. Go figure. And again, in the modern day court of law, they use this verse to substantiate the reason behind protecting thieves who are killed in the act of committing a crime. Some judges uphold it, other judges toss it out. It just depends. Okay. The next verse there. If he lacks the means to make full restitution, he shall be sold into servitude. In other words, he becomes a slave in order to pay for his theft. If what he stole, this talking about the thief now, is what he stole is found alive in his possession, whether there's an ox or an ass or sheep, he has to pay double. Well, back there in the end of chapter 21, it says he had to pay 4 and 5 times for stealing an ox or a sheep. Here he only has to pay double. So which is it? Again, it's another redaction. It was added without looking at the previous verses. And so you've got all these confusing, almost seems like contradictory statements. They're not really contradictory. It's just, one didn't look at the other. These were, again, let me look at this. Yes, in the outline, the beginning of chapter 22 is a different source. It's the E source. Hello? No, the D source. No, E source. I'm sorry. 22, beginning of 22 is the E source. The end of 21 is the D source. So 2 different sources, but still talking about the same thing. So that's why you get the differences. Okay, verse 4. When a man causes a field or a vineyard to be used for grazing, or lets his livestock loose, and it feeds on another man's field, he shall make full restitution from his field according to its yield. So he has to take from his crop and pay the guy back who owns the land what he lost or what the animals ate. But if all the field has been grazed over, he shall make restitution from the best in his own field and from the best of his own vineyard. So if they completely wipe out the other guy's crop, then they get to pick the best of what the other guy has as restitution for that. Verse 5, when a fire is started and catches brushwood, so that stacked grain or standing grain, now stacked grain is they would cut it with a sickle, they would tie the sheaves together and they would stand it in the field and let it dry before they threshed it. Standing grain means grain that hasn't been harvested yet. It's just still growing in the field. So if stacked grain or standing grain or a whole field is destroyed, the one who started the fire has to make restitution. When a man, verse 6, when a man gives to another money or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the man's house, then if the thief is caught, he has to pay double. 7, if the thief is not caught, the owner of the house shall be brought before God to determine whether he has not laid hands on the property of his neighbor. So they let God be the judge there, whether the guy actually stole it himself, was given it to keep it safe, and he stole it, then only God knows that, and he decides whether he's guilty or innocent. Verse 8, concerning every case of misappropriation, whether it's an ox or an ass or a sheep or a garment or any other lost thing of which a claim is made, this is it. The case of both parties shall come before God. The one whom God declares to be in the wrong shall make double restitution to his neighbor. So in this instance of thievery and manipulation of the evidence and everything else, God becomes the judge. And of course, who speaks for God in these instances but Moses? So Moses talks to God. God tells Moses what to do, and that's the law. That's it. There's no appeal. I mean, it is what it is. Okay, verse 9. When a man gives to another an ox, an ass, a sheep, or any other animal to keep, and it dies or is hurt or is driven away without there being a witness, an oath swearing before the Lord shall be made between the two of them to decide whether or not the one has not laid hands on the property of the other. In other words, if I give my cow to my neighbor to take care of, something happens to the cow, then you both swear before God that you're telling the truth. God decides which one's lying. You know, my neighbor could have just decided that he's going to take the cow for himself and hides it or kills it or butchers it or something. And so God knows that. He knows what's in the hearts of men. And so they went to God and God decided. Then it says the owner must accept this and no restitution shall be made. But if it has been stolen from him, he shall make restitution to the owner. If it has been severely torn by beasts, he can bring it as evidence. He shall not have to make restitution for what has been torn. Verse 13, when a man borrows anything from another person and it is injured or dies while the owner is not with it, then he shall make full restitution. If the owner was with it, he shall not make restitution. If it was hired, it was considered in the whole business of hiring that animal for whatever. Now, we've been talking about animals a lot. Now in verse 15, we change from animals back to people. And again, you ladies are not going to like these next few verses. If a man seduces a virgin who has not been engaged and lies with her, he must pay the bride price for her, a dowry, and make her his wife. That was the law. You did that, that was the law. So that's not the part that'll upset you. If her father, verse 16, absolutely refuses to give her to the man, then he must pay money equivalent to the bride price of a virgin. So they still have to pay, whether they marry him or not, because now they've been defiled. They're no longer considered pure. And so their marriage prospects have just dropped out completely. Verse 17, you shall not allow a sorceress to live. Again, a crummy translation. This is someone who uses other means other than God himself to decide what is true, prophecies, oracles, dreams, visions, and all this other kind of stuff. The Hebrew word there is feminine, but there were also male sorcerers. The most, or witches, okay? The most famous one is, of course, when King Saul, consults the witch of Endor. He's supposed to be God's king, and yet he consults one of these sorcerers who shouldn't have even been allowed to live, and yet the king, one anointed by God, goes to to this witch and consults her on what to do. Okay, verse 18. Whoever lies with an animal must be put to death. So no bestiality whatsoever. Verse 19. Whoever sacrifices to a god other than the Lord alone shall be executed under the ban. And the ban is referring to all the way back to the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And to spill blood, which belonged to God, Yahweh, in the name of another God, was kind of like spitting in God's face. You know, like neener, neener, neen, or, you know, I can do whatever I want. No, you can't. And they were put to death because that was God's law. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Verse 20, and here's some more of this whole business of taking care of the poor and disenfranchised. You shall not wrong or oppress a stranger. Remember, strangers didn't have their family around them. They didn't have their friends around them. And so they were kind of not on an equal footing with anybody else. And so people tried to take advantage of them. The law was that you can't do that because, it says in the next part of that verse, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You were sojourners. You were foreigners. You were people without, you know, friends and family around you. So remember the way you were and treat others the way you wanted to be treated. 21, you shall not mistreat any widow or any orphan. Now, why is this important? Because again, they don't have their brothers or their husbands or their fathers to take care of them. They don't have rights like everybody else does. So it's up to the community to provide for them and to nurture them and to take care of them. As if that isn't enough, then you go on to verse 22. If you mistreat them, this is like, here's the penalty. And they cry out to me, I will hear them. And my anger will be raised. And I will slay you with the sword. That's the flaming sword of the angel who stood guarding the gate to the Garden of Eden. Same word with that sword, that same Hebrew word. And your wives then will become widows, and your children will become orphans. So if you mistreat them in any way, I'm going to make your family widows and orphans and see how they like it and see if others will treat them fairly, because you won't be around to protect them anymore. So God is putting himself on the line for these people who don't have any way to support or sustain themselves. Okay, we got 6 minutes left, so I'm trying to finish this up. This is interesting. This is all about the sin, as they used to say in medieval times, the sin of usury, which literally means, it's a Latin word, but it literally translated means using someone else's money for your own purpose. And we do that all the time, and we pay interest. But according to this, that's not appropriate. Listen to what it says. If you lend money to any of my people, God says, to the poor among you, you shall not act toward him as a moneylender and charge him interest. Again, it doesn't say in Hebrew, that's not the phrase that's there. You shall not charge him for the privilege of using your money. He borrows your money, he uses it, and he pays you the money back. End of story. That was again a medieval addition to the text. And in verse 25, if you take your neighbor's garment as security, so we're going to make sure we get our money back because we're going to take your clothes away from you until you pay us back. And they actually did that because, men only had one coat, one cloak, one robe. Okay. People usually only had one. They were very expensive. Okay. Cause they were made out of wool. They had to be woven. They were their pride and possession. Remember the whole business with Jesus on the cross, and they cast lots for his robe because it was without a seam. You know, that was a very prized garment. And so they hung on to that because really that was one of the only things that the person had that was worth anything. So listen what they say. God says, you must return it to him before the sun sets. So you can hang on to it during the day, but at night you got to give it back to him. Again, it has a double function here. First of all, it reminds the person who lent the money or whatever that this is just a temporary thing. You don't have solid hold over this person because now you've given him back his collateral, if you will. But since it's his only clothing, it's a cloak from which he covers his body. In what else can he sleep? And it was, again, a sin to sleep naked because somebody could walk in when you're laying there and see you naked, and that in itself would be a sin. So they had to be covered. If he cries to me, God is saying, I will respond, for I am compassionate. And we already heard how God responds, and we don't want to be messing with God. So we don't want to go there. Now, there's some summary verses here at the end of this chapter. You shall not revile your God. You shall not anger him. You shall not tick him off. You shall not upset him or abuse, curse, slander, mistreat any ruler of your people. Now, why is that important? Because these elders and judges and Moses were all set up by God to handle minor cases all the way up to the major ones. And if you challenged them, you were disrespecting God because they were acting on God's behalf. God had set that all up. You shall, and now verse 28 and following is about the tithe. It says, you shall not hold back your first yield from the winepress. So the first batch of wine was always the best. They did 2, maybe even 3 squeezings of grapes. And the first wine was always the best. That belonged to God. The very first press of wine. You shall give me the firstborn of your sons. Remember, Eli was the firstborn son, or Samuel was the firstborn son of his parents. And she prayed. She was barren for a long time, and she prayed and prayed and prayed. And finally, God gave her a son, and she honored her promise to give that firstborn son back to God. And Samuel became a priest. So you shall give me the firstborn from your sons. You shall do the same with your cattle and your sheep. They shall stay with the mother for 7 days, and on the 8th day you shall give them to me. Now, why is that important? Because on the 8th day was the day of circumcision. It was also the day of naming that child. So the child was named in honor of God. They were marked with the sign of the covenant, which was circumcision, and they were given to God himself. Then verse 30, you shall be men holy to me. Again, referring to the men of the people. You must not eat flesh torn by animals in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. And the reason again being because the blood was not drained from the meat properly, so it was not kosher. So you couldn't eat it. Okay, we're going to stop there for today. So we got a little bit of time for questions and or discussion. Okay.
Mm.
Either that was very boring or you guys understood it perfectly.
Yeah.
One of the things you were talking about, the difference between the replacing it with 4 or 5 oxen as opposed to double,
Yeah.
in the first case, is it possible because it was killed with the first one? And the second case, it was, they were found where the animal was still alive?
Ugh.
Could be. I don't know. Again, there's no authority that we can consult about that. That's the problem. I wish there was, but you know, there's a lot of theories. And believe me, whoops, what happened here? I lost everybody. There you are. There's a lot of theories in this section about individual words, individual source pieces, redactions, and everything else. I didn't bore you with any of that. If we would have dealt with that, well, I'm just going to hold up my book here and show you. It didn't feel like we went over much, but we did, let's see, 341. We went through 100 pages of material just now.
Oh,
And that's only in one commentary. And I usually go through 5 or 6 commentaries. So there's a ton of stuff in here that I didn't deal with. There's context and there's all kinds of theories by all these different authors, some of which, and commentators and scholars, some of which I really respect. I've actually had a few of them as professors. The guy who wrote this book, Lee Childs, was a professor of mine at seminary. And so, you know, I pretty much stick with them, but there's so much in there. You know, like there's one argument in here in the very first part of this commentary on this section about what they even call this section. And it goes on for 22 pages on what to call it. That's how crazy some of this stuff actually gets. And so you've got, well, okay, like the picture behind me, that altar, that's a natural stone altar, okay? It does have a ramp, and you obviously had to get up there to do the sacrifices and stuff. But now remember, this is 1300 to about 1100 BC that this was taking place. Pants, any kind of pants, were not invented until about 500 BC. So, you know, that phrase about you shall not walk upon the altar doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Which again points to the fact that it was more than likely added after 500 BC when there were actually pants. And the altars were much smaller, and people were not supposed to actually walk up there where the sacrifices were being made. So, you know, there again, that was like 8 pages worth of argument. So I didn't go into that kind of stuff because I just don't think that's important. You know, the whole idea of a lot of this stuff is, you know, these people spend their lives, their entire scholarly life, arguing over the meaning of one word. And I think as long as we get the gist of what we're talking about, you know, God is in charge. He makes the rules, and it's our job to do the best we can to follow those rules, knowing that he's merciful and loving and forgiving. But at the same time, he expects us to put our best foot forward. No pun intended. So.
Now, one other thing you mentioned about some of these rules and that were used as justification for slavery in the United States.
Right.
And apparently when they were doing that, it's much like today, people pick and choose what they want to use. Because if they were really going to use the whole text, a person could only be a slave for 7 years.
Exactly. But see, they didn't want to talk about that part. That was what they used to refer to as the perforated Bible. You could tear out the pages that didn't apply to you. Only keep to the ones that supported your argument.
because they didn't have fences, I'm sure, to keep their animals in. How did they know which animals were theirs? You know, they talk about their bull or something going into the neighbor's. How did? Did they brand them then too?
No, they did not brand them because that was against God's law. That was, marking, tattooing, branding was all a no-no. What they did, at least the traditional explanation is they tied pieces of their own cloak or robe or whatever they wore on somewhere onto the animal, usually around the neck or somewhere about the head, so that they could identify their own animal.
Okay.
The problem always came up, these are pieces of cloth.
Right.
Hey, they don't last forever. And you know how cows or any animal get up against a tree or something or a rock and they'll scrape their neck, and itch, and they might tear it off or rub it off. Now, hey, that's a free animal. I could take that as my own. That's why the whole argument about who belongs to who or whose animal is whose. So you have to have different ways, marking them, but, and it could be, they're identifying marks somehow, the way their faces were marked, the color of their skin, or whether their tail was long or short. One ear was bigger than the, all kinds of silly ways that we don't even think of because, we have much different ways to do that now. Now every animal's ear tagged, it seems like, or chipped.
Yeah.
But back then they didn't have any of that stuff. So they used what they had at hand.
You were talking about all these books you have in volumes of redactions and arguments and whatever. When it really comes down to it, does it really make any difference as long as we're following what we're reading here? That seems pretty clear cut.
Exactly. That's the thing. And again, I say this all the time, and I feel like I'm often repeating myself, but the miracle is, I think, that in spite of everything that man has done to the text over the years, God's word still comes through. God's message still comes through loud and clear. This is what he wants us to do. But, like I said, there are people who will argue over one Hebrew letter or a Hebrew word or a phrase, on and on and on. One of the classic examples, and this is even in more modern times, is the Greek word baptizo. And this still going on today in our day and age. That's the Greek word for baptism. It means three different things. It means to sprinkle water, it means to pour water, or it means to dunk somebody in the water. Who's right?
Doesn't matter.
Exactly. The point is they're baptized. And it's God doing it. It's not us. It's not up to us to do something the one and only way to make it, hold. It's God's command. It's what God does in and of that whole thing. It has nothing to do with us. But, people are people and they're going to argue over every little bitty thing. And that's the craziness of it. But I also find it, maybe I'm weird, but I find it very fascinating to read all the different arguments and figure out all that kind of stuff. It kind of helps me anyway, when I look at some of the different arguments, then I go back and I read it in the original language, and it may help me translate something a little better in my own head, the way I think of things. I'll give you a primary example. I did not realize until I was in 2, 3, 4, 5, probably my 6th year of Hebrew studies, that the Hebrew word for repentance literally means to turn around 180 degrees. Because the Hebrew concept of sin is to turn your back on God, which was an insult to God. If you were arguing with a person and you turned your back on them, you know how a little child will, or maybe our spouse will, or we will to our spouse, kind of a thing. Okay. To repent, then, to say you're sorry, is you turn back around with your arms open. That's repentance. You're not only willing to turn and face God again, but you're reaching out to him to embrace him openly.
Like
And
giving them the cold shoulder.
exactly. And the opposite then would be giving them a warm hug.
Yeah.
Okay. And those are the kind of things that help me when I go back and look at the original languages. Those kind of ideas really resonate with me and help me get through some of this stuff, and give me a better understanding all the way around. That's why I really am sad that nowadays in our seminaries, our ELCA seminaries, no one is required to study original languages anymore.
Hmm.
You can get all the way through 8 years of school and become a pastor and never learn a word of Greek or Hebrew, which I think is horrible. Because I think you lose so much richness of the stories in the text. You rely on somebody else's ideas and somebody else's understanding of it, and you don't have anything, in your own head to work through to help make sense of it, to make it real for you, I guess. So anyway, that's my 2 cents on original languages.
Oh, gosh.
I see it as a way to control thought.
What's that? Not learning languages, or?
Right, not having them learn the languages, they control what they get.
Yeah, in a way. I think it's even more insidious than that. I think it's more or less, they don't want to go through the effort of teaching them anymore because a lot of people couldn't pass their languages. A lot of people struggled with it.
Yeah.
It's hard, and it's supposed to be hard because you're thinking in a different language. It's foreign. It's our concept of life is totally different than the Jewish concept of life. To them, life was a physical thing. It was the blood of whatever was alive. We don't think of that as life at all. We think of it as totally different. It's like the Chinese concept of death is a setting free from all the burdens and all the travails of this human life. They're free now. So they celebrate that. We don't see it that way. We see it as something to be feared and something to be looked down upon, something to be afraid of. I don't know. I think we lose so much richness when we don't have the original languages there to look at those different things. That's why I don't know. I just think it's very important, and that's why I like to share a lot of the Hebrew meanings for you. And like I said, I will get this this outline sent out to everybody in the next couple of days once I get back up to the office. Now the next section is, let me find it. Chapter 23. And let's see, is it going to 24? Yeah, we'll do 23 and 24 for next time. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, there she is.
Yes.
I got 2 heads.
Better than one.
Yeah, I guess. 24 is actually the section called the sealing of the covenant. Now that they've got all the laws, they've got the book of the covenant, and now God says this is permanent. So that's that whole section. Well, at least the first 18 verses of it are. And then, but go ahead and read all of chapter 24.
Okay.
23 and 24.
Okay. Any other questions or comments before we go?
Well, it's good.
You got it.
And Pastor, I'll work with Larry and make sure that link is working again.
Okay, great. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Are Wicks coming to church on
All
Sunday?
right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
thank you.
See you
Jennifer,
Friday.
Renee,
Stay warm.
Rita wants to know-
Yeah,
Yeah, Friday.
see you Friday.
All right, sounds good. Bye now.
Bye.
Oh, Dennis and Renee, Rita wants to know if you're coming to church on Friday,
Yes. I forgot to
Sunday,
call
excuse me.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. They
her.
said
Thank
yes.
you.
Okay. You know, those slots fill up fast, so.
Yeah.
I'm kidding.
Yeah.
We haven't watched last week's, have we? Oh, it's only Wednesday.
See y'all later.
All
Yeah,
right.
I was gonna sneak in, but the lights went out, so I didn't get a chance.
I know. You know, when I got back to church on the next day, well, actually on Tuesday, my clock on my desk was 12 hours behind.
Oh,
So it must have been out for 12 hours.
jeez. Good
At least
grief.
at the church.
Oh, yeah, good thing it was daylight because otherwise,
Yeah,
I'd
really.
yeah. So,
All right.
Oh.
Well,
All right.
see you on Friday.
okay,
Right.
good.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.